Good afternoon and welcome everyone to meeting number 6 of the Special Committee on Electoral Reform. Nous avons avec nous
We have with us today 3 experts on elections and electoral reform. Professor Kenneth Carty from the University of British Columbia, Professor Brian Tanguay from Wilfrid Laurier University,
Canadian Studies Program, Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Toronto. I think this is a very sort of interesting point in our hearings, because we've heard from the Minister, we've heard from the Chief Electoral Officer, the former Chief Electoral Officer, but now we're really starting a look from an academic perspective in many ways at electoral systems, comparative electoral systems, comparative experiences across countries. And so we're really looking forward to hearing from all of you today so that you can share with us the fruits of your research over time on these important questions, and allow us to get a perspective that we can take into further hearings, but also when we travel across the country. So, sans plus tarder, je ne sais pas qui va commencer.
So without further ado, I'm not sure who wishes to start. Perhaps Mr. Carty. Yes, Mr. Carty, if you would like to start, please. Thank you.
10 minutes, 10 minutes, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you all for the invitation to be with you today. Although my academic work has focused very much on the issues you've been charged with considering, it's also fair to say, I think, that I've spent a good deal of the last 30 years in the real-world application of these issues. I served the Electoral Boundary Commission, the Fisher Commission in British Columbia. I served the Loyalty Royal Commission on Electoral Reform over 2 decades ago. I worked for both the CBC and the British Columbia Ombudsman on electoral issues and electoral broadcasting. Consulted the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada. I was a Federal Electoral Boundary Commissioner for British Columbia after being appointed by the Speaker. And I directed the British Columbia Citizens Assembly on electoral reform, and subsequent to that, consulted with citizens' assemblies in Ontario, New Brunswick, the Netherlands, and the Constitutional Convention in the Republic of Ireland. So I've seen a lot of these issues in detail over the years in a number of different locations. And on the basis of those observations, I really want to make just 6 simple general observations and then happily respond to any questions you might have. My first observation, I suppose, is the obvious one, that there is no perfect or not even no best electoral system. That's why no 2 countries in the democratic world use exactly the same system to elect their parliaments. Each has had to find the unique combination of electoral system parts and the wide range of parts those go into a system that suits their history and their geography and their social order and their political life. You know, and interestingly, we saw this very much powerfully a decade ago when 5 provinces launched electoral reform exercises in this country. And at the end of those exercises, all 5 produced very different recommendations for different kinds of electoral systems. I think because they recognized that what maybe would suit them in New Brunswick was maybe not what British Columbians wanted, and so on. And in the end, of course, despite their discussions that were launched by governments in office, as all 5 of them were, none of those 5 different systems was adopted. In 3 cases because the provincial voters turned it down, and in the 4th because the government was defeated. So there's no perfect or best electoral system or easy choice. Secondly, I think it's fair to say our experience cannot tell us how a change in the electoral system will actually play out in practice. That's because under any new rules, the political parties, the candidates, and the voters will have clear incentives to behave differently than they do under the first-past-the-post system. Rules that change the voting system will directly affect the whole system, including the way candidates are chosen and who chooses them, the organizing and financing of campaigns, and how money is spent and collected in campaigns, the structure and the internal dynamic of political parties, the number and the character of the political parties in the electoral contest, the number and the character of the political parties that get elected to the House of Commons, and of course, the decision-making mechanisms that voters go through when they choose. So in the last election, of course, just for an example, we saw a good deal of strategic voting. Under a different electoral system, there may be none, because there wouldn't be the same kind of incentives for voters, there wouldn't be the same kind of candidates nominated, and their campaigns would be run in different kinds of ways. Thirdly, I would observe that when a different electoral system produces a different party system and a different parliament, it's going to produce a different pattern of government. That's quite clear about that. But we can't honestly say how that will ultimately work after new patterns of voters and candidates and members of parliament and political parties have evolved and changed over time. I think it's fair to predict that under most other electoral systems, majority governments of the sort that Canadians have been generally most used to will disappear. We have so little experience with multi-party governments in this country that we don't have any clear idea how they'll work, either in the short term or in the longer term, what they will look like or how they will work. They seem to be working very well in Denmark, for instance, where the Prime Minister actually comes from the third largest party in the Parliament. The parties have found a way to build working relationships. They don't seem to be working so well at this moment in Belgium or Spain, where the parliaments have been struggling to form a government. And the whole range of examples in between one could point to. So what governments will look like, we don't know, and how they'll work. This is something that we'll have to learn, and we'll have to change as new parliamentarians and new voter patterns evolve. Fourthly, I would say that we need to remember that the federal realities of our country will necessarily govern possible or even desirable reforms. If we maintain our constitutional practice that assigns members of parliament by province, then we must recognize that some systems that will work well in large provinces, like Ontario, might not work very well in the territories or some of the smaller Atlantic provinces that would have many fewer members, particularly if we want to go to some kinds of proportional system that consume more members in electoral districts. It, of course, would be possible to have different systems in different provinces or in different parts of provinces. We've experienced that in Canadian history over time, but that would undermine our understandings of elections as common national events, and we have to begin to think about what a national election was in that case. It would, of course, also produce a House of Commons whose members had very different responsibilities and orientations. If we're concerned with the principle of all votes counting equally, there's been a lot of discussion about that, then it may well be that the place to start is surely with the fact that we don't have representation by population in this country and never have. Votes have always counted more in Prince Edward Island than in British Columbia, several times more. And changing the voting rules to a different system isn't going to change that reality. That won't give us equal votes as long as we don't change that system. I know it's deeply embedded in the Constitution, and that's probably beyond where anyone on this committee reasonably wants to move. But that's a kind of reality when we need to keep in mind when we think about equal votes, this federal dimension to the system. Fifthly, let me say that the thousands of Canadians who took part in the recent provincial reform debates in the Citizens' Assemblies in Ontario and in British Columbia, in the Commission on Legislative Democracy in New Brunswick, on the Parliamentary Commission hearings all across Quebec, have been very clear about what they want in an electoral system. And they've identified pretty clearly what they think are the three values that they most highly value. One was fair representation, and by that most voters meant something like proportional representation was a value that was to be put near the top of the list. Secondly, they valued strong, identifiable local representation, by which they meant an individual local MP that they felt connected to and that they could identify with and would identify with them and their community. And thirdly, many Canadians, in fact, plurality in British Columbia, said they wanted more choice on the ballot. They wanted a more sophisticated ballot. The one they have now allows them to put an X beside one name, and they thought that, frankly, they made more complex choices every day in Safeway than when they went into the ballot box. And most other electoral systems provide for different patterns of choice, and so choice was something they would like to see. So that was the perspective of voters. But those are three very different aspects of any system: the counting rules, the representational basis, and the ballot form. And those three dimensions of a system, which are part of any different electoral system can be and are combined in very many different ways in different systems. And often to give up some of one is required if you want to get some of the other. For instance, it's widely recognized that there's always a trade-off between proportional representation and local representation. If you want a single electoral representative from your district, very hard to have proportional representation because you have to go to multi-member districts and so on. So that in fact all electoral systems involve difficult and contentious trade-offs between those three dimensions that then spill over into all the other dimensions of the electoral system I referred to. And that's in fact why the 5 provinces came up with 5 different systems when they went through this exercise, because they combined those basic pieces in quite different ways. Let me conclude with a more personal note, drawn perhaps a little bit less from the comparative experience. As a scholar of political parties, and I've spent my career studying political parties in this country and abroad, I'm particularly struck by the extraordinary role that they've played in Canadian history. This was a country put together by political parties and constantly re-engineered and reimagined by political parties as nation builders, and they are one of the few institutions that Canadians have in common. National general elections are one of the very few things that Canadians do together. On election day, we all do that together. And it's national political parties that tie us together at election time. When I cast my vote for a national political party's candidate, I'm acting in concert with my fellow citizens in Montreal and Saskatoon and hundreds of other communities across the country. And I believe we risk losing a good deal of what gives elections their national meaning, gives common cause to our public life together if we undermine national political parties. In the past, both of the great historic national parties in this country have broken apart and fallen into pieces, only to have been stitched back together in response to the powerful incentives of our current electoral system. The most recent example being the rebuilding of the Conservative Party after it broke into 3 pieces in the 1993 general election. My view is that with a highly proportional electoral system, there's a major risk that we would lose our national political parties. I think the electoral incentives would powerfully favor regional and sectoral parties at the expense of national ones. Our national parties might easily break into pieces of different kinds and different shapes depending on the party. And under proportional representation, like Humpty Dumpty, national parties would not easily be put back together again. If the country was badly governed, if there was evidence of genuine national democratic malaise, if there was a representational crisis, it might be worth taking the risk and moving to a radically different kind of electoral politics, a different kind of way of linking Canadians together on that one day in which we act together in consort in advancing our common community life. But I don't think those things are the case. So in defense of political parties and our common national political life, my own personal vote would be against proportional representation.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Merci, Professeur Carty, pour votre présentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Carty, for your very clearly delivered presentation. We will now continue with Professor Tanguay, who has undertaken research on electoral reform in liberal democracies and who has also studied the relationship between political parties and interests outside of the political system which have an influence on political parties. And I would also note that Professor Tanguay, in 2004, I believe, wrote the report for the Canadian Legal Commission entitled A Vote That Counts, Electoral Reform in Canada. Professor Tanguay, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone.
I'm extremely grateful to the Special Committee on Electoral Reform for inviting me to speak to today's session. The work being done by this committee, as everyone here no doubt knows, is of vital importance for the future functioning of our democratic polity, and I'm honored to be part of the process. In 2003, I had the great pleasure and privilege of working for the Law Commission of Canada, drafting its report, Voting Counts, Electoral Reform for Canada, which was submitted to the Minister of Justice in 2004. This followed an extensive and multifaceted public consultation strategy undertaken by the LCC, in which citizens and experts were asked what values they wanted to see enshrined in our electoral system. Two values appeared to be the most important to voters and experts alike when they were asked to think about their ideal electoral system. First, it should promote demographic representation. In other words, the legislative body that emerges after a vote ought to reflect or mirror the population that elected it. And secondly, the translation of votes into seats ought to be fair or equitable in its treatment of the political parties. There should be a rough correspondence or proportionality between a party's share of the vote and its representation in Parliament. Of course, there were other values, as Professor Carty mentioned. The importance of local representation came out strongly in our consultations as well. Just to underscore the importance that most voters place on this idea of the fairness of electoral outcomes, let me give you some illustrations from the 2007 provincial election in Ontario and the accompanying referendum, when 63% of those voting rejected a mixed-member proportional, or MMP, system for the province. At that time, a few colleagues and I conducted a survey of the electorate. When asked whether it was acceptable or unacceptable for a party to win a majority of seats without winning a majority of votes, 44% said unacceptable, versus 29% who thought it was acceptable. When asked whether a party that comes in first in an election with about 40% of the vote should get more than half the seats in the legislature so that it can govern easily on its own, only 23% agreed. Fully 50% thought that the party with 40% of the votes should get about 40% of the seats. This idea of proportionality seemed ingrained even among voters who rejected the MMP proposal. We conducted our survey after the referendum. Our existing electoral system, whether you call it single-member plurality, SMP, or the more colloquial first-past-the-post, whatever you want to call it, does not do a very good job of meeting either of the requirements that I've mentioned. Of course, this is not to deny that the present system is without its strengths, in particular its simplicity to the average voter, ease of administration, its promotion of territorial representation, the link between the voter and his or her MP in a defined constituency, its fostering of accountability. Voters can usually easily identify the decision makers, parties to reward or punish after their term in office through the time-honored practice of throwing the rascals out. But in terms of producing a parliament that is a mirror of the nation, the present electoral system does a very poor job indeed. It poses significantly high barriers to the election of women, minority, and Indigenous candidates. And this was actually one of the original complaints about first-past-the-post made by one of the earliest advocates of PR in the 1850s, John Stuart Mill. And first-past-the-post, as we know, simply does not produce proportional results. It does not treat all parties fairly. Most importantly, from my perspective, the present system throws up enormous barriers to the inclusion of new voices, like those of the Green Party, for instance, in Parliament, something that detracts significantly from the effectiveness of this body as a forum for the generation of new ideas and policies to cope with the challenges posed by this rapidly changing world. Taking into account the data from the public consultations, the LCC report's main recommendation was to establish a mixed-member proportional, or MMP, electoral system in Canada, similar to those currently in use in Germany, Scotland, Wales, and other jurisdictions. Such a system, in the thinking of the commissioners, would offer the best of both worlds, since it would feature the election of individual members of Parliament in geographically defined ridings, a hallmark of the British-style system that we've used here in Canada since before Confederation, along with European-style representation of diverse currents of opinion in the electorate through proportional representation from party lists. I don't have sufficient time to get into the nuts and bolts of the model that was proposed by the LCC, but suffice it to say at this point that the essential feature of the system would be to divide the House of Commons into two different tiers of seats. 2/3 would be constituency seats elected through first-past-the-post, and 1/3 regional list seats. In our current 338-seat Parliament, that would translate into 225 constituency seats, 110 compensatory list seats, with 3 single-member ridings for the territories, as is presently the case. Voters would have two votes, one for a candidate in a riding, one for a party, and they could split these votes, opting to support, for example, a Liberal candidate in their constituency while voting for the Greens on the party portion of their ballot. And we found in a country like New Zealand, which has adopted the mixed member proportional, that between 30 and 40% of voters will actually split their ticket. A party's share of the seats would be determined by the party vote, and the number of constituency seats it wins is then subtracted from this total. Remaining seats are filled from regional party lists, which would be determined in any of a number of different ways. The Law Commission proposed so-called flexible lists, which would provide voters with the option of either endorsing a party slate or indicating a preference for a particular candidate on the list. Since the Law Commission report was published, it's become abundantly clear in the referendum result in Ontario, for example, that a majority of voters will not tolerate any hint of party elite manipulation of these list candidates. That was one of the biggest factors contributing to the defeat of the referendum, in my experience. The other was the proposal to increase the size of the legislature, simply to restore the size that it had had prior to Mike Harris and the Progressive Conservative government being elected in 1995. That proposal raised the ire of a lot of voters. So if I were to rewrite or amend the 2004 report, I'd try to ensure that these lists were selected from, in the most open fashion possible, either in the form of completely open lists where the voter can tick beside whatever list candidate they would want to support, or even, why not, in the form of regional party primaries, which would be one of the most democratic ways possible of selecting these candidates. If this model were adopted, the MMP proposal from the Law Commission, one of the most significant consequences would obviously be to make majority governments an unlikely outcome of elections. Coalitions of necessity would become the norm. Many view this prospect with fear and loathing, but I firmly believe that this change would represent a tremendous opportunity for Canadians. One of the biggest flaws in the Westminster model is that it allows the governing party, with its artificially or mechanically swollen legislative majority, to dominate the political agenda almost completely for a period of 4 or 5 years, thereby contributing to the marginalization of Parliament. As Professor Henry Milner, and I'm happy to see that he's on the list of witnesses to appear this week, has recently argued, our electoral system contributes to what he calls PMO autocracy. And the only effective way of remedying this problem is to share power at the highest level by replacing majority governments with stable minority or coalition governments. I share the view of the Dutch political scientist Arend Leipart that the consensus democracies, those whose electoral systems are based on some form of proportional representation, on the whole have more satisfied electorates than is the case with the majoritarian democracies that operate under first-past-the-post, like our own, based on the Westminster style of government. The consensus democracies in Leipart's study, which is called Patterns of Democracy, do indeed provide a kinder, gentler form of democracy than their Westminster counterparts. And they outperform the latter in terms of representing women's interests, promoting political participation, and providing the majority of their citizens with an adequate social safety net. At the same time, Leipart shows that the most typical criticisms of PR systems, that they produce governments incapable of making the tough economic decisions and therefore lead to diminished economic performance, are highly exaggerated. PR systems are in use in a wide range of countries. Think of Sweden, Norway, Germany, whose economic performance has been as good as or better than ours or the United States in the last couple of decades. Even though the Law Commission report was shelved by the government of the day, its analysis and recommendations have continued to inform recent debates over electoral reform in this country. I know that Fair Vote Canada frequently makes reference to the Law Commission report, and I find that gratifying. This is an issue that simply refuses to die, no matter how many referendums or plebiscites were held in the past decade. And in my opinion, the only way to address the significant defects in our Westminster model of government is through fundamental electoral reform by adopting a system that ensures both demographic representation and proportionality in the translation of votes into seats in Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tanguay. It was very interesting to have that historical perspective from the report that you wrote. We move on now to Professor Nelson Wiseman, Director of the Canadian Studies Program and Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Professor Wiseman has appeared as an invited guest at the Senate's Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, the Standing Committee of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, and the House of Commons Procedure and House Affairs Committee. He authored an invited brief on Canada's fixed election date laws for the UK's House of Lords as well. And so without further ado, Professor Wiseman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for inviting me to participate in your deliberations. You're welcome to my 10 pages of notes. Your mandate is to study alternate voting systems, mandatory voting, and online voting. I'll state my positions briefly. There is, of course, as Professor Carty pointed out, no single best electoral system. If I lean toward any one alternate system, it's the hybrid system used in Manitoba and Alberta between the 1920s and the 1950s, which was you had a single transferable vote in one large multi-member riding for the cities, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and you had the transferable ballot in the other areas. I would not put the issue of an alternate voting system to a referendum. It's unnecessary, it's a waste of money, and it'll almost certainly fail. You may as well recommend not changing the system and save Canadians the cost. If you have a free vote in Parliament on an alternate system, if it's a free vote, I also believe it'll fail because it's not in the interests of most members or, quite frankly, the governing party. Mr. Kingsley gave you some examples of the distortions caused by the first-past-the-post system. Here's a more glaring example. In 1993, 2.2 million Canadians voted for the Conservative Party. 5.6 million voted for the Liberal Party. For all those Conservative votes, they elected 2 members. That's 1.1 million votes to elect an MP. For every 31,000 votes, the Liberals elected a member, and they got 177 seats. I do not favor mandatory voting. You've also discussed internet voting. I don't favor it either, but if it is going to be used, I think it should only be for the housebound and the disabled. Let me also say something about Elections Canada, because I had a chance to read the testimony of the Chief Electoral Officer. I don't think Elections Canada ought to have any education function beyond letting people know where to vote, the ID requirements, and how to register if not on the voters list. In other words, the conditions in the current Fair Elections Act. Now, many have studied alternate voting systems, including a number of provincial governments, citizens' assemblies, academics, the Law Reform Commission, and others. I'm curious what your committee is going to learn that is new. In fact, striking this committee suggests the government is hesitant to fulfill its election promise. There's been reference to the Ontario Citizens' Assembly, and I think let's look at it more closely because I think the experience is instructive. There were 986 submissions about changing the system. 692 offered pro comments, and only 78, or 8%, tendered con comments. By a vote of 94 to 8, the Assembly proposed MMP. But in the referendum, the cons prevailed overwhelmingly. As Professor Tanguay voted out, barely more than a third of the public voted for it. I respectfully note that Mr. Reid discounts the cost of referendums. He said to the media, if we're worried about the cost of democracy, then we should suspend having any future elections, shouldn't we? This, I submit, is a false equation. If Parliament changes the electoral system without a referendum, the international community will barely take note. If elections are suspended, the reaction will be much different. I'm aware of a recent poll that says 65% of respondents favor having a referendum. I suggest you discount such polls. I have yet to see a poll on any issue where respondents said a referendum was not their preference when they're asked. I think referendums are a dreadful way to determine policy or to be taken as the cardinal measure of democracy. If Canadians feel strongly enough about how a government has changed the electoral system and they oppose the change, they'll defeat the government in an election no matter what system is used. The term democracy is too readily bandied about in debates about the electoral system. Democracy has a kaleidoscopic quality that transcends election rules, much more vital than the electoral system, much more vital than turnout rates or a country's underlying political, cultural underpinnings, the health and vigor of its civil society, the independence and probity of the judiciary, media freedoms, transparency and accountability in public administration, informed debate in crafting public policy, unfettered competition in political ideas. And on these scores, Canada's electoral system is actually a sidebar. Now, proportional representation promises to end distortions caused by the current system. And proportionality, incidentally, is something courts consider in the context of Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The ranked ballot, which I do not oppose, may also cause distortions. A party could receive 40% of all the first-choice votes and not win a single seat. BC's experience demonstrates the public's appetite for electoral reform varies with perceptions of the unfairness of the most recent election. In BC, 58% of voters supported a change in the 2005 referendum, but 61% opposed it in the 2009 referendum. This suggested a fickle public, but the elections held before the referendum explain the inconsistency. In 2001, the Liberals won 77 out of 79 seats on 58% of the vote. The NDP only won 2 seats out of 79, and it got well over 20% of the vote, 22%. This seemed palpably unfair to many. In 2005, however, the Liberals won 46 seats on 46% of the vote, and the NDP won 33 seats on 42% of the vote. For many, this fair outcome sated their appetite for change in the 2009 referendum. I do not believe there is much popular desire for change nationally. The public perceives that although the Liberals won just less than 40% of the vote in the last election, the result was consistent with 2011, when the Conservatives won the same percentage, and in both cases, the parties formed majority governments. Now, MPs are elected to act on their party's platform and to exercise their judgment, not to make policy by transmitting the momentary and impulsive opinions of their constituents. Now, some believe a constitutional convention requires a referendum. I think you're going to hear this tomorrow. I disagree, and tomorrow you'll also hear from the eminent constitutional scholar, Peter Russell. I look forward to his opinion. He may surprise me, but I think he shares the view that there's no such convention. Some argue, and I saw this argument in the Globe and Mail by the former Prime Minister's legal advisor, that a reference case is necessary because the courts might rule a change unconstitutional because it lacks provincial concurrence. They cite the Senate reference case. There's no parallel in my opinion. Senators represent provinces and provincial interests. MPs do not. They represent parties and the people in specific constituencies. In the Senate case, the reason we had a reference is because many provincial governments questioned the constitutionality of the federal government's proposals and launched references themselves. No province has hinted at questioning the constitutionality of changing the federal electoral system. And if they do, I think they'll be batted down by the courts. I have many more comments and observations, but thank you for your time.
Professor Wiseman, you have about a minute left, but I see your brief is much longer. Do you want to address some of the points in the rest of your brief through answers to questions, or are there specific points you'd like to make in the minute that remains?
Okay, let me attack Elections Canada because nobody else has.
45 seconds to do that.
Elections Canada doesn't need an education campaign to alert voters to a new system. The media, the parties, and the candidates will do it. In my opinion, Elections Canada has become too big and is constantly looking to increase its bureaucratic net. It and many others, including media outlets and over 400 academics, claimed that the Fair Elections Act would disenfranchise citizens and lead to lower voter turnout. But we had an uptick in turnout from 61% to almost 69%. It has never increased that much between two elections since Confederation. And linking the electoral system to citizen disengagement is unconvincing. I suggest you look at what happened in New Zealand. I believe my time is up.
Thank you, Professor Wiseman. Well, thank you to all three witnesses for those obviously very well informed by experience and research positions on electoral reform. Positions, I would add, that are not all in harmony, which will make our discussion that much more interesting and stimulating. So we'll begin, we'll do 2 5-minute rounds, sort of keeping with our normal practice that we've established already. We'll start with Mr. DeCourcy for 5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et merci à vous.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'd like to thank the three of you for bringing your perspectives to us today. I know that your opinions are based on years of experience and hard work on these files.
Of everyone here. Professor Cardy, you talked a little bit through your experience working with different institutions, and in your research there's an appetite for citizens to have more choice in their balloting. I think Professor Tanguay, you mentioned the Law Commission work cited some desire for that. I didn't hear that, Professor Wiseman, but maybe starting with Mr. Cardy, can you speak to some of the benefits that you may see or that you've heard from citizens if they were allowed to have more choice or more preference in their balloting? And then maybe get perspective.
We heard a very great deal about this in the British Columbia exercise, which involved the Citizens' Assembly and 50 plus public hearings around the province, and in many of the presentations in which voters said, you know, we're faced with a kind of put an X beside one name or another, and that really doesn't give us much kind of choice. And they understood, because they'd been studying other systems, that in some places they were able to perhaps rank order 1, 2, 3, the order of their preference, or that in some systems they had a vote for a candidate and a vote for a party, so that there was a range of different ballots that offered them more and what they believed to be more sophisticated or more complex patterns of choice, and that they were keen to exercise those, given that they had one day every 4 years to have some kind of input. The other reason that was often strongly voiced was that they believed that this would give them more say in who their representative was, and they thought that in fact the losers in that, or the people who would have less say, would be the political parties. I mean, there is a deep antipathy and suspicion amongst the voters of political parties, and I think, you know, 30 people get together in a church basement somewhere and foist a candidate on us. If the parties had to give us several candidates and we got to choose one, then we would have more say. And so it was a way in which they believed that this would be a way in which citizens would have more say with respect to the parties and the candidates they offered, even in a party they strongly supported. It was a way, I guess, they would think of kind of bringing a primary system, kind of building it into, in fact, the electoral system. So there was a kind of double level of choice there.
In terms of the Law Commission, one of the reasons we recommended mixed member proportional was precisely because of the fact that it would seemingly maximize choice for voters. I mean, it gives them the opportunity to vote for a candidate, which we heard loud and clear is very important for voters. The geographic link that they have with their representative. But at the same time, I mean, the other portion of the ballot, you know, this fact that you would get 2 votes, the other for a party, which would allow some kind of heightened strategizing on the part of voters, right? In a single riding, they could say, you know, I really do like the Green candidate, but I think it's really important that the NDP get support. So they can play one off against the other, and we've seen from the operation of mixed member proportional in Scotland, Wales, and New Zealand that this form of strategizing, individual strategizing, does take place, and it does seem to be important to voters.
And Professor Wiseman, if you have any comment.
I don't think Canadians are terribly interested in this issue. I think studying alternative voting systems is an elite pleasure industry. If you look at any of the polls taken before the election, the last election, and people were asked, what are the most important issues? Changing the electoral system does not register. Now, are Canadians interested? The people that you will be meeting, and you're going to be traveling across the country, I suspect are going to be largely self-selected. Most will be in favor of changing the system. But they will not be representative of the public. We have experience with one standalone referendum on the issue, and that is in Prince Edward Island. In all the other places, and I heard Mr. Reid refer to a turnout of 61%, the referendum in BC, but that's because there was an election going on. In Prince Edward Island, where the turnout rate is consistently 80% and above, it was that in the last election, when they had their standalone referendum on an alternative voting system, according to Peter McKinnon, the political scientist, 35% of Islanders turned out.
On that note, we'll go to Mr. Reid, who I'm sure will have a number of questions. Mr. Reid?
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to start by asking Professor Carty to give a comment on, really to follow up on a comment that Professor Wiseman had made. Professor Wiseman has indicated he's not an enthusiast for referenda on this subject. Professor Carty, you were involved in the design of the BCSTV system, which was subsequently submitted to a referendum. Back in 2004, you indicated that you thought referenda were the gold standard, as you put it then, for deciding on electoral reform. That was, in all fairness, before the referendum that took place. I'm just wondering what your views are today on that.
Well, I would say I wasn't involved in designing that system. That system was designed by the Assembly members, and I was only a humble servant of them in that exercise. The evidence from the referendum, and we did a fair amount of research after the referendum, was that the large majority of people who voted in the referendum really knew nothing about the issue on which they were voting. People who voted for the referendum voted to adopt the system, and I think someone said 58% voted in that referendum in favor. The large majority of people who voted for it were people who knew about the Citizens' Assembly and who approved of that exercise. What they were really doing was signaling their approval of an initiative that had come from their fellow citizens. They understood their citizens had spent a year going around the country, the province, consulting, thinking about it, and working out a range of alternatives, because they devised an MMP system, an STB system, the first past the post system had chosen. And so the vote, all the evidence does suggest from the polling we did was that people who voted for it were really people who knew about the system, but more to the point, knew about the Citizens' Assembly and believed that they had done a good job. People who, the majority who came to the polls who knew nothing about it, essentially voted against it. And I think certainly the evidence from Ontario suggests too that the large majority who come to those referendums really know nothing about the substantive details of the issue. Now, in both those cases, they were being asked to vote on a very specific proposal. because both those citizens' assemblies weren't recommending a change to an MMP system or to an SDV system, but were recommending a very detailed, worked out, complex system in which it would be probably unfair to expect people to understand. As to what I said in 2004, well, sorry, I don't remember.
That's fair, and I did not mean to imply...
Or the context. But I think our evidence suggests that it wasn't a good exercise. And there were other aspects of the Citizens' Assembly that in retrospect didn't work very well. And if you're interested.
Yeah, I did not mean to imply at all that you were in any way manipulating the Citizens' Assembly, but you did participate and provide expert information to them. Let me ask this further question then relating to the whole notion of Citizens' Assembly. This is an alternative way that this process, which we are engaged in today, could have been done. And it does raise the question, whatever comes out of this process, there's a committee, this committee which will make a report, and then the government may or may not choose to follow that report. The government has been very explicit that Cabinet will have the final say on how this thing is designed. This raises the question, is that going to cause the same outcome to seem less legitimate in the eyes of Canadians than it would have been had it come out of a Citizens' Assembly exercise?
I don't think we know about that. I think it will depend on what comes out of it. You know, people have conflicting views about the legitimacy of everything governments do. You know, the Citizens' Assemblies were held because, really following the example of Premier Campbell, who thought it really wasn't the business of politicians to be writing their own rules. That was his logic. And it was one that he, in effect, sold to his caucus and he sold to the province, and so the Citizens' Assembly went around the business of devising a system. The counter-argument is it's precisely the business of elected representatives to make these kinds of decisions. So I don't think that we could extrapolate one way or the other in terms of how people would respond to a report that came out of a balanced committee that had a kind of measured consideration in terms of a proposal that ultimately came out.
On est rendu à la fin de 5 minutes.
We're at the end of the 5 minutes. We will be able to come back to your questioning later. We will now proceed to Mr. Cullen. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I wouldn't mind, perhaps, Mr. Cardy, later finding out some of those lessons learned from the Citizens' Assembly. That is not the direction the government has chosen, although we preferred one. Perhaps not today, but I know there was a great deal of, particularly the side of the things learned. I want to turn... buy the book. There was a good book promotion in there somewhere. It is an excellent book. I'm pulling a question to you, Mr. Tanguay, and it's with respect to what you learned out of the Law Commission and what we learned from other research of that direct connection, whatever system we come up with, that there's some direct connection between a voter and who represents them. You've talked about potential of a party primary to derive the list. There's been concerns about MMP systems around the world where parties and party leadership decide who that will be on that list, and that there isn't as much a connection. They're like senators suddenly. You don't know who they are and you don't feel any connection to them, and that wouldn't be healthy for democracy. Have we seen that anywhere? Can we find some modeling of how that primary system would work in terms of deriving those lists? And I assume it's at a regional level?
It would be at the regional level, and
Okay.
to my knowledge, no, that's sort of my thinking, that this would be... I mean, the Law Commission advocated what we called flexible lists, where you could choose, as a voter, you could choose between either
Open
the party
lists.
slate
Right.
or for individual candidates on that slate. And
So I'm imagining something akin to what we have right now, which is candidates for each of the parties runs in local nominations at that riding level and first past the post. But in a consensus-based system, that proportionality get made up of also candidates who but ran at a more regional level were picked and then presented to the voters that way.
yes,
Okay. I committed to taking some questions from Twitter, and Eleanor Grant has consented to me asking this. If a Conservative in Toronto or an NDP in Atlantic Canada, you would like a sympathetic rep to talk to that knows your region. As it is right now, if you're a Conservative in downtown Toronto, you're Liberals, if you're NDP out in Atlantic Canada, if you're a Liberal in Vancouver Island, What does a proportional system offer that's improved from the winner-take-all system for people who happen to live in a region in which their political views are not being expressed at the winner at the ballot box?
Again, if it's the Law Commission model, it combines the two of geographic representation of single representatives in a defined constituency, supplemented by these compensatory list MPs, however they're chosen. What we seem to find in both the Law Commission and subsequently the Ontario referendum is that the regional compensatory lists have to be small enough that you can't be, a voter in Nipissing getting somebody from Toronto representing you.
That's right, that right scale level.
Exactly.
One follow-up question, perhaps, and I don't know if Mr. Wiseman could comment on this, or Mr. Tanguay, I think you made reference about the stability of governments that are chosen by consensus democracies, by proportionality. How stable are those governments? Because there's sometimes inference that they're not. How successful are those democracies? And by that I mean economically, social programs and that type of thing. Is there anything to fear in the examples that have gone ahead in other countries that have chosen proportional systems in terms of the effect on real people's lives and real outcomes in terms of policy? I don't know, Mr. Wiseman, you want to start, and perhaps Mr. Tanguay?
Well, we could talk about the Nordic model. It seems to have worked well up there. Denmark, Norway, Sweden. We could talk about what happens in the Mediterranean basin. Well, in Israel and Italy and Greece, it hasn't been quite that cooperative. So that comes back to my point that the electoral system is secondary to the underlying political culture. That's going to be much more influential. And as Professor Carty pointed out, there's no way of knowing how things will work out, but I'd be fairly optimistic if you change the system. In New Zealand, after it was changed, and voters wanted a change, they voted in favor of it. They got the change, and then they got very upset. And had we had another referendum, they would have reversed it because they felt that that a small party was the tail wagging the dog. The smallest party joined with an unlikely.
Did they not have another referendum? They had a second one, whether to keep it or return back to the first past the post, and they chose to keep it, did they not? They did.
Yes, because after that election, now the politicians and the citizenry are adjusted to the system, and it seems to be working there. I'm not an authority on New Zealand, and I think that'll happen in Canada.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. C'est maintenant au tour de...
Thank you very much. It's now up to Mr. Thériault. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I greatly appreciated the presentations from each one of you, and I appreciated your frankness, whether or not I agree with what you said. But you spoke about about the political culture, and I'm speaking to the three of you. I have had the luck of being able to tour Quebec over 4 years with Quebec's Commission on the Mode of Elections, and what people told us across Quebec, in every region of Quebec, beyond the mechanics of the election, beyond the details of the way that the vote was held, what they came back to time and time again as an irritant was the way that politics are done, and particularly the use of the party line. Political parties are ideological machines of war. A mixed system will necessarily lead to coalition governments. Will this necessarily improve? Will it make people less cynical when it comes to their governments? If, on the one hand, accountability, because the political culture is the way it is, if the responsibility or the accountability for what happened under a government is clear when it comes to election time, or the question of the list is created by who? Even if there are primaries, even if it's up to the voters, the list is always in the hands of a choice made by the parties. The parties will choose the first 15, for example, who will be prioritized. Is the party line not stronger in a system like that? And the determination of the government by the creation of a coalition government, is it not decided by party apparatchiks after an election? And even though I want to see change, is it not possible that these changes would lead to greater cynicism if the political parties don't adjust? And how can we expect that the political parties will be able to adjust to the new system? And what will election platforms look like after 25 years if we just see coalition governments mandate after mandate? So several questions in there. Yes. Well, first of all, the reform called for by the Law Commission, could it reduce the level of cynicism among the voting public? I would say that yes, in part. Professor Carty has already said that there is enormous skepticism right now of political parties. And this makes our job as, for example, a committee, makes your job as an electoral reform committee very difficult, because that cynicism is reflexive in many cases. It's not necessarily based on reality, the way things actually are. So again, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, a system where the result, where the coalition government would force the political parties to collaborate, could reduce the level of cynicism. I think if we look at the facts, the things that reinforce cynicism in Canada among the electorate is, well, this adversarial way of undertaking politics, which is key in the Westminster system. I think that reinforces cynicism, and systems based on a proportional election system force the political parties to collaborate, and that could reduce the level of cynicism in part. It wouldn't be a panacea. In terms of the party line, well, again, that depends on the way that we choose candidates on the list. If, yes, the political machinery and the elites seem to have control over who is on the list, well, that will consolidate, strengthen cynicism. But if it's up to voters to choose through, for example, a primary system, or through a completely open election, then I think it would be very difficult to say that, well, it's the elite in the parties who are controlling the process. Thank you. There are about 5 seconds left, so we will move to Ms. May.
And thank you to all of the witnesses today. I noted that Nathan Cullen had intended half of his question to go to Professor Tanguay, so I'm just going to follow up. You may have been ready to jump in, and we ran out of time. But the question that was being asked was whether we had any evidence of how consensus-based PR systems perform in terms of indicators of stability of governments, economic performance, and so on. If you had any comment on that, I wanted to give you a chance.
Thanks very much. Again, I mentioned in my remarks the study, sort of the seminal study by Arend Leipart, the Dutch political scientist, who divided up OECD countries into consensual versus majoritarian democracies. And he found on a whole range of indicators that the consensus democracies, those that use some form of proportional representation, had happier, more content electorates, more citizenry, performed better on a whole range of social indicators, were certainly no worse, and in many cases better than the majoritarian countries like the UK, the USA, Canada, in economic performance. So one of the key elements of consensus democracies is coalition government, which forces collaboration among parties, which leads to greater continuity of policy outputs. All of that leads in a kind of beneficial feedback loop to a happier electorate.
Well, while I'm with you, Professor Tanguay, I wanted to ask, I've had this idea, I think it's used in, I think Scott Reed actually remembered that it's used in one state within Germany, but the most open of lists that I can imagine would be if the proportionality to redress skewed results that did not reflect how people had actually voted would be just to take the top performing candidates from those who'd run across the country under the party banners nominated through the usual way. Has that been an idea that you would be, instead of your regional primary idea, would that be sufficiently open? Are there flaws in that?
It is a very good idea, and I will say that the Fair Vote Canada is currently drafting a kind of proposal that would be based on the best losers is the term that's sometimes used for that. I guess that's derogatory.
That won't catch on.
That's right, the best runners-up or something. And the advantage there is that these are all candidates who have sort of presented themselves before the electorate in one way or another, whereas list candidates, whether they're chosen through a primary or an open ballot or a flexible list, whatever, some of them would never have actually sought election, in the hustings, as it were. So that would be the great advantage of that particular system, and it is something that Fair Vote Canada is actively pursuing at the moment.
So my next question to Professor Carty. I was struck by your presentation because you said things, and with all due respect, I thought it was the opposite. So I just want to put it to you where you said that a highly proportional political system will encourage regional and sectarian parties. Now, I've always been of the view, with all due respect to my friend Luc, that the Bloc Québécois could never have become official opposition other than first past the post. I mean, how do you have a party that only runs in one province assemble enough seats to actually be the official opposition in our parliament, if not for first past the post? So that's why maybe you were just contrasting highly proportional representation systems versus a proportional representation that included mixed members. I was confused by the comment. Perhaps you could clarify.
I think my observation was that I believe under relatively highly proportional, even moderately proportional systems, the big national parties would be disadvantaged. And in fact, it would be to the advantage of different parts of these national parties to kind of go their own way. As the Conservative went three ways in 1993, without first past the post, they would never have come back together. And I think that over time, we would have, in fact, the erosion of national parties, because it would be there would be electoral incentives in different regions among different groups to produce their own candidates and not be tied by a national platform. And so I believe the real risk of proportionality is the erosion of national parties and I believe national politics. Mr. Theriault made the very wise observation that political parties are instruments of war. They're instruments of conflict. And the question about electoral systems is, where does the conflict take place? Does it take place within the parties, between the parties, amongst the candidates? And every electoral system changes where the conflict takes place, both at the electoral level and at the governmental level. And so what we're thinking about is how we organize conflict in our society. I mean, that's what democracy is trying to do. And how does it get structured? And what are the consequences of different patterns of conflict? And so my observation was simply, I think that proportionality will generate patterns of conflict that will be antithetical to broad national political parties that have been critical to our national development.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Sahota.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here today, and I'm quite enjoying this your testimony today, because it's eye-opening and very blunt, so I like that. I appreciate that. We were talking a little earlier about education when it came to the referendums we have had in Ontario and BC. Mr. Wiseman, you were saying that you didn't want Elections Canada really, or think that Elections Canada should be involved in the education process. We've been, I feel, we have an ambitious agenda ahead of us, and we have been reassured by Elections Canada that, once this committee comes up with a recommendation and it passes, we will be able to put a new system in place. My concern, however, is how do we educate the people about this new system? Are there any lessons that were learned from, BC and Ontario about the education process in that referendum? And then, Mr. Wiseman, if you could also comment on why you think Elections Canada shouldn't be involved in the education process, because I know they're eager to make sure people are we increase voter representation and voter turnout, and that we educate them on the new system. If you can all comment on that.
Well, the experience of the British Columbia exercise was not encouraging. The major paper in the province, the Vancouver Sun, assigned a full-time correspondent for the entire year, and the Assembly and all its work was covered in enormous detail. The newspaper published the entire report in full in the newspaper, yet we know that when most people came to the polls, they really knew nothing about it. It turns out, I'm really loath to admit this to political scientists, that most people don't go to bed at night thinking about electoral systems and dreaming about possibilities, but that's the truth. And so the challenge of educating would be enormous, and I think most people would learn simply by doing the first time. If I had a simple-minded solution, and this is one that Wiseman's really going to hate, it would be the power of compulsory voting. Because I think then that would produce enormous incentives for the political parties to get out and educate large numbers of voters in a way. Now, large parts of campaigns are spent identifying the vote and getting people to the polls. You all know that. I mean, you live by that. If you have compulsory voting, parties don't need to spend nearly the same kind of time of identifying voters and getting them to the polls, because they're going to get there. And I think one of the experiences of Australia is with compulsory voting that that means the parties spend an awful lot of time trying to educate the people who are going to show up about what's at stake and what their policies are. And so what you want to do is create a system in which parties and active participants who have something at stake are actively engaged in educational work.
Yeah, I based on my experience in the Ontario referendum campaign, would not be optimistic about the prospects for political education through the party organizations themselves. I think that kind of education is always going to be refracted through a partisan lens. And what we found in the referendum campaign is that the parties played a confusing role. They sent out confusing and mixed signals to their own voters. That was especially true in the Ontario Liberal Party at the time, which itself was conflicted over its initial recommendation of creating a citizens' assembly to explore electoral reform. If that means a greater role played by Elections Canada in educating voters, I would be all for the bureaucratic overreach entailed in that system. I don't see it occurring through the parties themselves. Another thing was that there was a lack of information in the Ontario referendum campaign. The Citizens Assembly report was not published, as far as I know, by any newspaper. The copies disappeared very early in the referendum campaign. I remember, going out to sort of local farmers market and people saying, do you have a copy of the report? And I never did. I'd have to try to summarize it myself. So there was lack of education, lack of information, confusing signals put out by the parties themselves. All of which led to less than optimal context for the conduct of the referendum vote itself. And again, just to confirm sort of something that Professor Carty said, what we found in Ontario again was the more people knew about the system being proposed, the more likely they were to support it. But that was a minority of the voters.
Thank you. We'll have to go to Mr. Kenney. But you have about 5-10 seconds left. We'll make up for it on the next round. Mr. Kenney.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all three of the witnesses. One point that seems to be held in common by the three witnesses, if I'm not mistaken, is the view that, first of all, the public, broadly speaking, does not follow in great detail questions about electoral systems, and that, as we just heard, perhaps wasn't even aware of this as an election debate. Now, it's the contention, as a matter of debate in the last general election, it's the contention of the government that it has a mandate for potentially radical changes to the electoral system without reference to the people directly in a referendum, because it was included, the commitment to end first past the post was a platform item. Do any of the three witnesses have any evidence that this was a top-of-mind consideration for voters in the last general election?
I have none.
No.
I'm quite certain it wasn't. There isn't a poll that mentioned it, but that doesn't take away from the fact that parties act on their platforms, and that people and that justification has been used by every party.
Quite, but has it been used for radical changes to the electoral system before in Canada?
Nobody's proposed it.
But it has been, has it not, Professor Weissman, in the Prince Edward Island, Ontario, and British Columbia instances, all three governments ran on a mandate to change the electoral system after consulting the public, either through citizens' assemblies or referenda or both. Is that not true?
No, they simply ran on a platform that they'll have a referendum. The story in Ontario, and I'm quite sure in British Columbia, is that the parties didn't take positions on it. In fact, if you read the media, it would be hard to know that when you went to vote, you would have two ballots, one for who to vote for and one on the referendum.
So, Mr. Weissman,
indeed, 138,000 fewer ballots were cast, left blank, on the referendum question in Ontario.
Mr. Weissman, it was your contention that there is no convention in Canada for a referendum to be held prior to significant changes to the electoral system. But is it not true that those three referenda constitute a clear convention, that in every modern effort to reform the electoral system, it has been submitted to the people for their judgment? Does that not constitute, I ask this of all three witnesses, does that not constitute a convention?
I don't think it does, not a constitution.
Not at all.
And indeed, where does that mean it would have to be 60%? Look, if the governing parties were interested in changing the electoral system, they would have not set a bar of 60%. That's a clear signal you don't want it to change.
Now, Mr. Weissman, you've said that a referendum is not necessary and it would be defeated. That is to say, a proposal to change from first past the post would be defeated. Is it therefore, as an advocate of changes in the system, are you not saying it's unnecessary precisely because voters would choose something other than your preferred option?
My position is that voters will adjust to whatever system is devised, and that they won't have any problem with it after, as Mr. Carty said, after they do it once. They'll see what will happen after.
Your position, tell me if you think of this as a mischaracterization, that potentially radical changes to the electoral system are supported by, shall we call it, elite opinion. You said 600 or so of the 900 submissions to the Ontario Citizen Assembly, for example, but that it is not supported by popular opinion.
It's not supported because the public doesn't think about this issue. As Professor Carty said, they don't go to bed at night, and changing the system is not going to, it doesn't take away from people's right to vote or their preference to vote. The assumption in your question is, it seems to me, that changing the system favors a certain kind of party. For example,
it was the, Professor Carty just indicated, there was the view of former Liberal Premier Gordon Campbell that the electoral system did not belong to politicians but to the people, and therefore they should be involved, but initially through a citizens' assembly and ultimately through a referendum in any changes to it. Professor Weissman, you're now suggesting that not only should there not be a referendum, there shouldn't even be a free vote in the House of Commons, that the executive branch essentially ought to dictate a system. Why do you reject Premier Campbell's contention that the system ultimately belongs to the people and they should have the ultimate say?
I'm not opposed to free vote in the House of Commons. I just believe if you do have a free vote, it'll be defeated. I'm not saying the government should act without a free vote. That's up to the government to act. If you want a free, I don't have any problem. With respect to Campbell, Campbell was interested in getting re-elected. One of the ways you get re-elected is you tell people, we're going to give you a referendum on a question. Well, I like referenda. Give me any question. I want to vote on it.
Okay, well, we'll have to move on now to Mr. Aldag for 5 minutes, please.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to turn my questioning to the issue of online voting. And Professor Weissman, you'd started off, you'd indicated you didn't have support except perhaps I think you noted for the housebound. And I'd like to just get your thoughts on your hesitation or resistance to online voting, and then move it to our other two witnesses to get your thoughts or comments on the question of online voting.
In my limited reading in this area, I've seen that the preponderance of experts are opposed to it because it's easy to, not easy, but you can hack the system. A few years ago, 3 federal government departments were hacked. We have no idea of how extensive the information was that was lifted. Hey, we just had the Democratic Party, the DNC, hacked. At the University of Toronto, the students decided, students are ahead of me, I don't even have a cell phone, that by having internet voting, it would increase participation because turnout was only 15% when students went to vote. Well, they introduced internet voting. Turnout, 15%. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, University of Western Ontario had an election for their student council and president. It was hacked. The NDP had a convention to select the leader. Hey, snafus appeared. Can you imagine what will happen on election night? The internet is convenient, but incidentally, it's not a social activity. It's social when you show up at the polls, you meet your neighbors, you get in line, you talk to other people. Pressing these buttons at home is cocooning.
Okay, thanks. That shares your concern. So if I could move to the other two, if you have any thoughts on
this isn't something that I've done research on, but like Professor Wiseman, I would be worried about the security aspects of online voting, but nonetheless, I'm intrigued by the prospect and believe that a number of studies at the municipal level here in Ontario are being conducted, will be conducted in the future, and ought to continue to be conducted. I think it's definitely something that should be explored. All the while keeping in mind that, the internet is not necessarily a secure environment for this kind of thing.
Yes, I know nothing about the technicalities. I've heard both the current and the past chief electoral officers say that they don't believe that the security concerns have been dealt with yet. So, I mean, I think this is an issue probably for the future.
You still have a couple of minutes.
Okay. The next one I'd like to look at, we've talked about the idea of referendum, and we're hearing some ideas or concerns. I've particularly enjoyed, Professor Wiseman, your candid thoughts on this. I would like to throw out to all three of you, we are as a committee trying to have meaningful consultation with Canadians, and setting aside the question of whether or not there's a referendum, what advice would you have for us as far as getting out and having meaningful discussion with Canadians on this work? The question about how to go forward on electoral reform in Canada.
I think this committee should continue to conduct the work that it is doing. The town halls are going to start taking place, or already have started taking place. This committee should conduct its work, issue its report and recommendations, the government should bring in legislation, and there ought to be included in that legislation some provision for review in the future, which could include, need be, referendum. But I think at least one electoral cycle should take place, maybe two, with the recommended system. I think Professor Wiseman has made the case that the referendum on this is not needed, and in fact might just muddy things. But by all means, include a provision for reviewing whatever new system is brought in after one or two electoral cycles.
Well, I've had a experience of probably hundreds of public consultations on electoral boundaries, on different electoral systems across this country, and my experience is that they're not very helpful at all. Most people who come to them either come with their own very narrow agenda with a line to push, or really don't know very much about it. Where they can be very helpful is if you had a concrete proposal you're seeking response to. Certainly that's the lesson of electoral boundary commissions. We go out and hear ideas for boundaries, and you get stuff that's not helpful to boundary commissioners, but when they propose a map, then you get really specific suggestions and reactions that can be enormously helpful. So I think in the advance, without a kind of specific proposal saying, look, what do you think about this, and how should we think about it, it's very difficult to get very coherent, cumulative opinion
Thank you. We'll move on to Mr. Blakey, if that's all right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've heard a fair bit from Mr. Carty in terms of his views of the impact that a proportional system might have on regionalism in Canadian politics. I kind of came of age in an era where, under the first past the post system, Canadian politics was intensely regional. You had the Liberal Party, which was really the party of Ontario. You had the Bloc Québécois representing Quebec. You had the Reform Party representing all of Alberta and much of Western Canada. So to me, I'm personally open to the idea of trying something different. I know that regionalism in Canadian politics was one of the considerations of the Law Reform Commission report in 2004. I wonder, Mr. Tanguay, if you could share your views on how switching to some model of proportional representation might impact regionalism in Canadian politics.
I'm not as convinced as Professor Carty that it would be the death knell for national political parties. I don't see Canada as being riven by, what political scientists call cleavages, as, say, Belgium. The model proposed by the Law Commission, again, would have a built-in kind of threshold. You'd need probably at least 10% of vote in a region to get one of those list seats. So the worry that there would be proliferation of fringe or extremist parties and that the national parties would fall apart, to me, seems exaggerated. I just don't see, and I share actually your views that so eloquently stated in the preamble to the question that, I mean, we grew up or lived through the near death of the country, all under first past the post. I don't think that mixed member proportional would exacerbate regionalism. I don't think it would be any worse than it is now.
Do you think, to the extent that it might help get regional voices inside national caucuses, that it could actually have the effect of reducing regionalism in Canadian politics?
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask, one of the cardinal problems, I think it's fair to say, critics of the first past the post system would say that one of the major issues is that, with a minority of votes, you get 100% of the power. When we look at the kind of two main streams that you can choose as an alternative to that, you have the alternative vote system and you have some form of proportional system, and there are many configurations. Which of those two do you think are most likely to duplicate that problem of the first past the post system, and how?
I personally am not a fan of the alternative vote, although it does give greater choice to the voters. It seems to replicate all the problems that we find in first past the post. So the ranked ballot by itself would not address the issues that certainly we heard from citizens at the time of the Law Commission and at the time of the Ontario referendum. That system would not address the flaws in the current system that are so in need of resolution. Yeah.
So maybe a more kind of philosophical question that I'll put to the entire panel is, for me, part of the question between trying to decide between an AV model and a proportional model of some kind, if there's agreement that we're moving away from the first past the post system, is really, are we electing just a rep from a local constituency, or are we trying to elect a parliament, and to have a parliament that represents the diversity of views within the kind of Canadian context, and do we affirm the idea that parliament, however many parties might be in it and however much they might have to compromise and negotiate, would be better if it represented that diversity of opinion. And even Canadian voters within themselves are sometimes divided. They say, well, I really like that person, I'd like that person to represent my area, I don't really like their party, or I don't like their leader. Geez, I wish I could vote for party X and candidate Y even though they don't belong to that party. So do you see part of the point of an electoral system to represent a parliament, or do you think it's really just about who is the person who's representing this particular point on the map that we've carved out?
I appreciate your concern. I'll tell you what I think will happen. And unlike Ms. May, I don't think it's the first past the post system that generated the Bloc Québécois. I think what will happen with a proportional system is you're going to get a BC First Party. And people in British Columbia will appreciate, given the number of seats they have, yeah, they're not going to become the official opposition, but in a minority parliament, they could be the difference between keeping a party in, being part of the coalition and not. And they could end up driving the agenda of a federal government in favor of British Columbia, and we'll get an Alberta First Party. And actually, the position of the Bloc would probably be reinforced. So I think that's the danger. We saw in Israel a pensioners' party arose, but on vital issues of war and peace, they had no position whatsoever. They were simply interested in securing the position of pensioners. So that
Merci. On doit s'arrêter là pour donner la chance à M. Deltel.
Thank you. We need to stop there to give Mr. Deltel a chance to speak. Mr. Deltel. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, welcome to your parliament. It's always very impressive to see so much quality per square foot around the table. Thank you very much for your interest in Canadian democracy and in the work that we are doing on this beautiful July day. And maybe it's not so nice in Ottawa, but at least it's very nice here in this place. There were very many interesting things that you mentioned earlier, and there are some things that I agree with and some things that I don't disagree with. Mr. Tanguay.
To understand that what we're talking about is nothing but trying to get the best for Canadian, because there is no perfect system. If we had one, well, we would use it. Il y a un commerce au Québec qui dit souvent si ça existe.
In Quebec, it's often said that if it existed, we would have it. So if it exists somewhere, a perfect system, well, we would have it. But we know that there is no perfect system. And there's something that I was really surprised by, and Mr. Wiseman, I'd like to go back to this.
And you said you do not disagree with free vote, but you said that if there is a free vote, well, there will no change will happen. So I would like you to explain more about that. I want to hear you about that. How can you go to this conclusion today?
I come to the conclusion, well, look, I'd love to be proved wrong, and I'm wrong 70% of the time. But I don't, that bit of the Liberal platform, I don't think many people who ran as Liberal candidates stressed it or really that was vital to them. Most of the people, I think, right here were not elected on a majority vote. So they look around, they know how they got elected now. You're taking a risk by having it. Now, you're going to be traveling around. I want to get back to this point about how do we find out what Canadians think. Professor Carty talked about the limitation of town halls. I have a suggestion. Every MP sends out householders. You'll find out. Ask them a specific question on this. And I think you'll find, a lot of detachment about it. Although, again, it's self-selected who responds to these householders and the surveys, but you might be surprised about how few responses you get.
I strongly disagree with when you say that there is no free vote, or if there is a free vote, well, we can lose. Because as far as I'm concerned, first of all, we are always free to vote. Whatever the vote, we are always free. But also, and the most important thing is that let the people decide. I do agree with you when you said that the Liberal, and I will not talk about on behalf of them, but I'm sure that those people in front of me didn't have a lot of talk from their constituency about that issue. And I can quote you, member from Hamilton East Tonoe Creek, who said a few weeks ago that, quote, "It is something I've heard anything about on the campaign trail. I don't recall one conversation at the door that had to do with that," unquote. Well, it's clear, crystal clear. I can assure you that's exactly the same thing in my riding in Louis Saint Laurent, Quebec City area. And since the beginning of that committee, no one, except those who are involved in politics, no one talked to me about that issue. But you know what we're talking about? It's very serious. We're talking about making a big move. So this is why it's quite important. And at least, if we follow your guide, if you follow what you're doing, what you're saying to us, saying, well, don't have a free vote. Okay,
a free vote.
But you said don't try a free vote because you can lose.
No, try it.
Okay.
I'm just speculating that it'll be defeated.
Okay,
I
great.
support the free vote.
Okay, it's a good
I'm
evolution.
eager to have your free vote.
That's not exactly what you said at the beginning,
Oh,
but it's
I'm
a good
sorry.
evolution. I do appreciate your evolution.
Yeah.
But the point is that if we don't have a free vote on that issue, and if we don't have any referendum, at the end of the day, just one man will decide, the Prime Minister. And we know where he stands. The actual Prime Minister said many times before he became leader, before he became Prime Minister, that he did strongly support, and he does strongly support, the preference vote. That's his choice. I do respect that. But now, when you are Prime Minister and you own the power, as you described it quite well, when you own the power, as the Prime Minister owns the power, well, all this decision belongs to one person. Is that fair? Is that democratic? I don't think so. So this is why we do support referendum, don't you?
I think it's more of a rhetorical question because we're out of time. We'll go to Ms. Romanato.
Merci beaucoup. Merci nos témoins pour.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today.
In your scholarly article titled Political Turbulence in a Dominant Party System, you wrote that the Canadian electoral politics is both regional and volatile, and that the result of this volatile multi-party contest in single-member districts is a high level of turnover in the House of Commons. So I have two questions for you. Do you have a preferred electoral system that would remedy the volatility and reflect the regional and local political preference? And my second question, in your opinion, how does the current electoral system reflect the many social cleavages of Canada in the House of Commons?
I don't think I do have a preferred system. You know, I worked awfully hard for a decade not to have one when I was working with the British Columbia citizens, and frankly, I can see the advantages of an MMP system or an STV system that you'll hear about, I guess, tomorrow morning, or a Finnish list system, which is someone described with every candidate in the country's name is on the sheet, and you just pick the one, and it's translated. I mean, there are hundreds of possibilities, and they all involve trade-offs. You give a little bit more proportionality and you lose a little bit less local representation. Or you give a little bit more voter choice and then you lose a little bit less the party's capacity to discipline their members. And so they all involve trade-offs, and I don't have my own preferred system, I don't think. The Canadian party system, in my judgments, its great success has been in some sense preventing the enormous variation in the cleavages and the divisions of Canada from spilling into our parliament in a way that would make us a dysfunctional country. You know, the New Democrats exist as a kind of coherent national party. I don't think we want to produce a system in which the elite New Democrats and the not elite New Democrats have incentives to kind of run independently, because they would see they could get more votes in different parts of the country from different elements of their constituency. One of the strengths of the way our system has worked is it has in fact forced, in some sense, the parties to work hard at preventing that expression of so much division in a country that's constantly changing. You know, the Canadian political system has been a remarkable experience. Our electorate grew in the 20th century far greater than any other electorate in the world, much larger than the United States. It went from a country of kind of small rural people to the most multicultural urban place in the world. And however you measure the transformation of Canada, our democratic social order has probably been transformed more than any other democracy. And somehow our big national parties have found ways to accommodate that. And it was different in the First World War, and the Second War, and in the 60s and the 80s. And so I think it gets high marks, frankly. Our system of governance was just rated by the people in Davos as the second highest in the world. We're at the top of the United Nations political development indexes. So I think by most comparative indexes, we've done pretty well. The electoral system hasn't been responsible for all that, but it's been one of the pieces. And you start undoing the pieces, and you start undoing that system. So that's a sort of a small c conservative view, I guess.
Okay. my next question is on something we talked about, we touched on briefly, mandatory voting. Professor Wiseman, you mentioned in the Hill Times that if politicians were serious about increasing voter turnout, that they would make mandatory voting, they'd put it in place. I know you mentioned earlier that you're not a supporter of it, and so my question is to all three of you actually. How would you see a Canadian mandatory voting system if we were to implement one, and what would we do to insensitize or penalize people? What would your suggestion be in that regard?
Well, the system I think that the Australians use works perfectly well. It's simply the law requires you to show up at the polls and cast a ballot. You can spoil the ballot if you like. You can, write anything on it you like, but you must attend and take a ballot. And those who don't attend and don't have an excuse, there's a modest fine. And so the first time there'd probably be a number of people who didn't. But after a while, people would start to obey the law, the way they stop at red lights and pay their taxes and all the other things that they're required to do, I think. So it would probably be a bit sloppy the first time, but like any change, and we've talked about other kinds of changes, the public and the players would adapt, and the campaigns would run probably very differently. We'd end this kind of mass voter mobilization kind of stuff because the voters would get themselves to the polls themselves, and it would just, you wouldn't spend money on that. Parties would be engaged in other kinds of activities.
Merci. Nous sommes rendus au bout de la...
Thank you. We are now at the end of the first round, so we will begin our second round of questions with Mr. DeCourcy for 5 minutes. Thank you again, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to go back to the line of questioning that I began earlier in speaking about the preferences or the various choices that a voter might be faced with.
Preference or more choice for electors. In the reflections that you've had from the different commissions, assemblies, research, is it likely to enhance voter turnout if electors could check more boxes, claim more preference in their votes, relative to the ease in which people understand the system now versus a change towards more preference? Where is the increased complexity? And thirdly, election day. As the results are tabulated, what could electors expect for a return on a ballot where there were more than one checkbox or multiple choices or two different, I guess, streams of election? And I'll be happy to start with Professor Tanguay.
All right, in terms of what might happen on election day, it might take longer to tabulate the votes. If you've got more choice, that is one of the drawbacks in, say, STV. It can take longer. The vote counting process is much more complicated and time-consuming. Will it increase turnout? Most comparative research seems to indicate that proportional systems provide a bump in turnout of about 6 to 7 percentage points. And that may be a reflection of the fact that, again, more currents of opinion are reflected in the resulting legislature, which brings more people to the polls. But that's not a hard and fast, it's not a law, a social scientific law. And if you want to look at the experience of New Zealand, voter turnout increased in the first elections using the new system, mixed member proportional, from 1996 on, but afterwards fell again. The constraints, the factors, the dynamics that are driving down voter turnout extend well beyond the electoral system. And I think if you want to get a handle on what's happening, you have to look more and more at what young people are thinking and why they're not coming to the polls in the numbers that we older, aging boomers think they ought to be coming to the polls in. Personally, I do think that if we offer more choice to voters, and I'm just going to editorialize just a second. I mean, I think that so far we've heard a lot about the fears of what might happen with a change, that national parties would disintegrate, that fringe parties would proliferate, and that the system has worked well as it is. But you have to ask for whom. And I think the one group that consistently has been excluded is young people. And I think by offering greater chances to newer parties, non-mainstream parties, you would mobilize more young voters and bring them into the system in a way that the status quo does not.
Thanks very much. With the time left, Mr.
About a minute and a half.
Maybe I'll go to Professor Cardy and.
The evidence on turnout is pretty complicated. You're going to be hearing from Andre Blais later this week, I believe, and nobody in the world knows more about the relationship between turnout and electoral systems than Andre, so I would recommend you listen to him. The reason that the Citizens' Assembly in BC chose the single transferable vote, to the surprise of everybody, was because they believed it offered them more choices, because they could choose both candidates and parties in whatever order they liked. It's true that the counting process is a more complicated one. The Irish who use it for their national elections don't start counting until the next day, and in some of their districts it takes 2 or 3 days to count. They actually instituted electronic counting of the ballots, which gave them instant results a few years ago in a couple of ridings, and they hated it. They actually liked the 1 or 2 day kind of who's ahead on the first count, who's ahead on the second count kind of a process, and they would crowd in and watch the process, and it was, and so they just said they sold all the machines at a huge loss, and they're now out of the electronic machine counting business. So, they were recognized that there was a kind of social dimension to the electoral process that engaged them all, and the count was part of that, as well as the vote counting.
Thank you. We'll move on now to Mr. Reid.
Thank you. I don't know if you know the answer to this, Professor Cardy. In Ireland, they have multi-member districts. I believe the boundaries conform with the traditional counties. For each party in the Irish system, when they have a number of candidates running in a single district, how are they chosen? Is it some sort of internal party process, or is it a more democratic process?
That's changed over time. The boundaries are less and less coterminous with county boundaries as the population is becoming more mobile, and they've been less and less successful of doing that. The parties vary in terms of how they choose their candidates. They, say a 5-member district, a party would not run a full 5 slot of candidates because they know the result will be sort of proportional. So if they thought they had a chance of maybe getting 3 elected, they would probably nominate 3. They don't want spillover waste in the counting process. But by and large, the parties have now gone to a convention process. It's not unlike ours to choose their candidates. They were organized differently in branches that did it in the past. They now go to conventions. That's been complicated in the last year by a new law which requires that 30% of the candidates must be women. In the next election, it'll be 40%. Now, the parties can violate that regulation, but if they do so, they lose financial support from the system. So in a number of ridings, to make sure the party got to their quota, they've had to kind of go in and say, okay, you can have 2 candidates in this district, one has to be a woman, one has to be a man, or things like that. So there's been shifting kind of tension between locality and central party, as there are in any proportional systems, in terms of who gets to choose the candidates and how that process works. And that would be, in fact, one of the biggest changes, if we change the electoral system here, that the parties would have to experience, is the process of how to identify candidates, how they would be chosen, and so there'd be a lot of conflict would be transferred into the parties in the first round or 2.
I wanted to ask Professor Tanguay, returning to a comment you had made earlier and following on Professor Cardy's remarks, you had said that in 2007, one of the lessons of the referendum in Ontario was that the people tend to reject party-controlled lists. Is it the case then that some people were voting no in 2007 because they felt that the list side of the MMP system that was being proposed in Ontario was going to be too much party-controlled, or just elaborate on that if you could?
No, that is exactly what happened. I think that the 2 aspects of the proposal that came in for the most criticism were, first of all, increasing the size of the legislature. A lot of people were really upset about that. But secondly, the closed list system. was portrayed very negatively in the media as backroom individuals, usually men, chomping on cigars, selecting their friends to be at the top of the list and guaranteeing them election in perpetuity. So it was extremely easy for the media to portray the closed list as something inherently bad. Although, in defense, I guess, of the Citizens Assembly and the people who work for it, I know Jonathan Rose is going to be on the appearing here before the committee. The closed list was always thought of as a means of promoting sort of non-mainstream candidates. So an easier way of increasing the chances of election of women, minority candidates, or indigenous candidates. But most voters, a large majority of voters who were voting on the merits of the system itself, rejected that idea.
That raises a tension that I've thought exists for some time. I know one can design an MMP system in which the list is open and is chosen through some sort of democratic process. On the other hand, that will almost certainly, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but that will almost certainly mean that one of the chief selling points of MMP, which is it will produce a larger range of the kind of candidates who right now tend not to be presented, and that they'll be at the top of the list where they're likely to get elected, is effectively canceled out. I don't know if there's a way around that tension. You're the expert.
That's the reason. I mean, you're quite right. The purely open list would maybe not eliminate, but reduce the opportunities for promoting non-mainstream candidates. And that's why the Law Commission settled on the flexible list, where, again, it's sort of the best of both worlds, part two, where you could have parties promoting a slate that would consist largely of non-mainstream candidates, and then the individual candidates for those voters who really are concerned about their capacity to reject elite control by the parties.
Mr. Cullen is next. Yeah, we go to Mr. Cullen now.
It segues nicely. We're from that conversation to another question from Twitter, which we're trending, by the way, Mr. Chair. I don't know if you know that. The committee is trending. There's lots going on, and we're near the top of the list. This is from Charday B. Was asked, what's the impact of having women and minorities better represented in legislatures on the public policy produced? So is there a connection between voting systems, I'm going to suppose in this, and the representation of traditionally underrepresented groups? Mr. Wiseman, you seem to want to come in on this.
I just wanted to relate what happened in New Zealand. This is my understanding when they introduced MMP. More women got elected, no doubt about it. But guess what? Power does not lie in Parliament. It lies in the Cabinet. So fewer women ended up in the Cabinet because you had a trade-off among the leaders. How many Cabinet posts is each party going to get? And we're going to get to decide who's in them. Right now, there's pressure on a Prime Minister to have a diverse Cabinet. But the pressures will be completely different when you have horse trading among the parties.
Perhaps. I'm trying to follow just the idea. If someone says to me having more women in Parliament is going to be bad for women in power, I understand this very explicit example you're using in this circumstance in New Zealand, but the other cases that we've studied here today show that the opposite is true, that more women end up running more things under proportional systems.
I don't know. I'm just saying the dynamic is different. It's parties that will want a lot of women or minorities at the top of their list, but it'll be party leaders who get together after the vote when there's a minority and say, okay.
Right. I suppose, but it's 2016 after all, so I'd imagine if party leaders cropped up and put a bunch of, no offense, old white guys up into their cabinet and nobody else, there may be a natural consequence to that next time voters get to vote. So I want to turn to Mr. Tanguay for a moment. You've broken these down into two sort of families of systems, voting systems. I'm trying to pull back from this a bit in terms of the details to get the the broad flavor, that there's the consensus democracies and there's ones that use majoritarian systems. First past the post is in the second, in a majoritarian. Where does AV lie, alternative vote lie, so-called?
Majoritarian.
That's so it's in a similar, it's in the same family as first past the post.
As with the French two-round system.
Right,
same
okay.
thing.
That's the same thing. That's a winner-take-all type approach. The other families, the STVs, the mixed member, those are all the proportional, what you're calling consensus democracies. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. To Mr. I just want to clarify the groups. Sometimes they get confused. You talked about party and the tension between, if we went to some alternative, excuse me, not alternative system, if we went to a proportional system in which there were lists of some kind, there were nominations within parties to formulate those lists, as we talked about maybe regional runoffs or some sort of primary, that there's a tension between the party. There's obvious tensions between parties and their membership now on nominations. Is that fair to say?
Sure, and where those tensions get played out and by what rules will be governed by the new electoral system.
Right.
You know, the tensions will exist, and different systems provide incentives for particular kind of behaviors, and they reward certain strategies, and they disadvantage others. And so, but when we're talking about changing electoral systems, we're not just talking about counting rules. We're talking about nominations and finance, and I mean all aspects, because the rules change the incentives that govern the actors.
The last question to you, Mr. Tanguay. I went back a bit, and I want to go into some details. Mr. Kingsley has made a proposal in which there was a mixed system, in which there would be larger ridings in the urban areas of Canada, in which 4 or 5 constituencies would be made one. There would be 4 or 5 representatives that would come out of that, and they would have a more proportional reflection. The rural constituencies, he's argued, would remain essentially the same size, which would eliminate the need to go and redraw boundaries in any significant way. Do you have any comments on that proposal?
Interesting. I think Professor Wiseman mentioned it as the system that was in use in some of the western provinces from the 1920s on. Interesting idea. I would suggest that people take a look at Fair Vote Canada, which is coming up with a similar kind of system, but where there would be more attention paid to compensatory outcomes. In other words, where the results would be even more proportional than the system that you're describing.
Merci. On passe maintenant à Monsieur Thériault.
Thank you. We will now move to Mr. Thériault. So many things to say. First of all, I would like to quickly say to my colleagues, Mr. Blakey and Ms. May, who brought up the 1993 Bloc Québécois results, that instead of considering that quote-unquote a regional aberration, I would note that I'm a sovereignist, everyone knows that, but the Supreme Court justices in paragraph 164, 165 said that the Federalist system represents the most remarkable manifestation of the importance attached to political representation of regional interests in Canada. And further on, they quote the Fathers of Confederation, where it is said that all proposal that would recognize the individual nature of Lower Canada would not be well accepted. There's no desire to create regional individualism. So what happened in 1993, beyond the simple numbers, well, this was simply the manifestation of the political dynamic in Canada at that time after 2 failures, 2 attempts to redefine Canada. And so the nation spoke out, and the Bloc Québécois formed the official opposition. There's nothing that is aberrant in that. And we saw something similar in 2011, a will of one region, Quebec, to give an opportunity to the Orange Wave. That having been said, you've said that there's no perfect system. Well, what I'm concerned about, it's not the principles, it's the how, the how-to. When we went around Quebec over the course of a year, or several years from 2003 to 2007, we had a bill, we had a model, and we were asking people questions about something concrete. Here we have nothing before us, and we're going to consult people in 338 ridings to say what exactly? What kind of electoral system do you want? And you say that nobody's interested in this, so how that we need, and yes, education is important, yes, but it's very complex. So at the same time, how can we imagine that changing the democratic rules of our society can be done without letting the people decide on the advantages and disadvantages, because there's no perfect system? So I'll ask you to please answer that question. So how can we imagine that if this isn't a debate for experts or for politicians, how can we imagine that the only education over X months could justify changing the rules, and to see people come to vote next time, they won't even know how it's going to happen without a referendum?
Are constantly changing, and we don't have referenda. The Fair Elections Act wasn't put to referendum. The Election Act that took force in 1974, when for the first time parties' names were put on a ballot, that wasn't subject to referendum. The expansion of the House of Commons, and I think most Canadians are opposed to having more seats in the Parliament of Canada, that wasn't put to a referendum. That's why you're elected. You're elected to make public policy, not to stick your finger in the wind. And that's why I'm actually surprised not surprised, but when I look, I'm cynical about the creation of this committee and your traveling around the country, because I thought if the government was serious, they would introduce legislation. And if they really wanted to find out what parliamentarians think, give them a free vote. Can I just say something about mandatory voting? I see it more as a right than as a duty, but I'm not opposed to it. I just don't think it's in the interests of most MPs to do it. And instead of a penalty, as in Australia, where incidentally voter turnout isn't much above 80%, I think, in New Zealand, where they didn't have it, they've had elections that have turnout has been as high as 98%. Rather than a penalty, which you can get out of, I believe, if you have an excuse, offer them a carrot. Parliament has introduced so many boutique tax credits, give them $20, $30. I mean, right now it costs about $30 for every vote that's cast.
We'll go to Ms. May now, please.
Okay. I'm going to start with a question from Twitter, so I don't forget to ask it. It's to Professor Tanguay from Jennifer Ross, and she wants to know, what would you think of minority governments who choose to work with an accord with another party less than a formal coalition? Any thoughts?
Well, we do have the experience of one in Ontario's history from 1985 to 87. From the perspective of voters, I think it was a good thing. 2-year accord between the NDP and the governing Liberals, in which the Liberals implemented a lot of the demands of the NDP, which were popular with voters, like a ban on extra billing by physicians at the time, which was a key issue. The problem was that in the subsequent vote that was called in 1987, the moment the accord ended, the NDP was massacred. And the Liberals got all the credit for many of the policies that were thought up by the NDP. So the problem with that is in the nature of minority governments as they exist under the existing rules of the game. The biggest prize is the majority government. So everyone has an interest in trying to undermine the opponents, not collaborate in real terms, so that they can, the next election, win that magic prize.
Yeah, that's certainly my observation in the brief time of my life that I've been in politics, is there are incentives built into first past the post that discourage cooperation or even recognition that another party has a good idea.
That's exactly it. And I think a lot, from my personal experience, a lot of voters find that really frustrating.
So I'm going to my own questions now, and it's going back to the very provocative point made by Professor Wiseman. What can you learn that is new? And the question of public consultations. I did, in fact, do a householder to everyone in my riding. It was 100% on basically a primer on electoral reform. I got back over 300 individual responses, handwritten and mailed in, and 80% plus wanted to get rid of first past the post. And then it broke down, as you would imagine. Some wanted STV, some wanted MMP, some wanted a hybrid. Overwhelmingly, they didn't like the idea of mandatory voting, interestingly enough. So that's my Saanich Gulf Islands. But in terms of consultation with the public, do you think, and I believe in public consultation, by the way, we're going to do everything we can as a committee, but in looking back at the experience of the BC Citizens Assembly, the Ontario Citizens Assembly, the 2004 Law Commission, do you think we will have lessons learned there that there isn't really anything new under the sun, but we should brush these off and learn their lessons? And I'll ask all three of you.
I mean, I think that you're going to be rehearsing and revisiting all the issues that were taken up by the Law Commission and the Citizens Assemblies and the Legislative Commission on Democracy in New Brunswick and the very large amount of work done in Quebec as it traveled the province and by the Royal Commission in Prince Edward Island. So, you know, all this has been there, done that in what we have to learn, and it's on the record, and so it's there, and I think that you're going to perhaps have these hearings, but you're not going to hear anything that you couldn't find out from these various sources, and I think without going to the hearings with 2 or 3 specific proposals, here's an idea for this, this, or this. What do you think of these 3? What are the pluses and minuses of the, what do you call them, basic types that Mr. Cullen is referring to? It'll be hard to hear anything that's cumulative or helpful.
I've still got time to hear from Professor Tanguay and then Professor Wiseman, so I'll just go in order.
I think it's certainly possible to learn new things, and that you will. A lot has happened in the world of electoral reform in research about it since 2002-03, when this whole process took off at the provincial level. And I think those who spend their time designing electoral systems have learned lessons from the experience of New Zealand, from other countries that have changed their system. And I think that will lead to more interesting and more substantive proposals in the current round of consultations. So I'm optimistic about the prospects.
Well, what I learned from your report on your Saanich Gulf Islands constituents, who are very atypical, because look, they elect a Green MP. Where else in the country does that happen? So I don't know what it is they're smoking out there. But having said,
we unfortunately, we won't. We won't have time to find out because the 5 minutes is up. We'll now go on to Ms. Sahota.
I wanted to follow up on my colleague, Mr. DeCourcy's question. Mr. Wiseman, you didn't get an opportunity to answer it. His question was, just to remind you, it was along the lines of if more preferences are given on a ballot, more options are provided for, how would this affect voter turnout or election night results? And if you didn't get an opportunity to answer that question, so I just wanted to pose that to you.
I'm not sure I heard it. Like, if you provide all these alternatives, does it increase voter turnout?
That, and how does it affect election results?
I don't, well, it'll affect election results because there will be all kinds of different strategies and calculations in terms of the candidates. You're not going to badmouth somebody else if you want their second choice vote, for example. But I don't think it has any effect on voter turnout. And I look at New Zealand. From 1946 until 1966, turnouts in New Zealand were from 84% to 98%, according to a website I looked at. Since 1996, only one election has had turnout higher than 80%. It's been as low as 74%. So I don't really think there's going to be any impact on voter turnout. And here's where I really want to be provocative in this. I'm not as concerned about voter turnout as most are. Professor Tanguay taught me that voter turnout has been declining in Western democracies since the 70s. So Canada is not exceptional. And it could be that when you have lower voter turnout, it actually reflects the fact that people, you know, they may think that it doesn't matter who gets elected, the quality of their life, their material well-being is not going to change greatly. Now, there's another factor. Although youth vote at a lower rate, I would say youth are more involved in politics than ever, but it gets expressed in different ways. They join NGOs. They join Greenpeace. They do research for the Sierra Club. So they're engaged in issues, and data studies by Elections Canada show this.
Now I just want to turn to another question. We talked a lot about Canadian values. I just wanted to give all three of you an opportunity to express, I mean, we have an idea of what you prefer, but also if you could just state that outright one more time, what system you prefer, regardless of, you know, some of the shortcomings that all systems have, and what you absolutely think that Canadians would just not go for, what would not work in Canada.
Well, I don't think first past the post works, but I think Canadians prefer it because they know it, and people would go with the devil they know rather than the devil they don't know, especially, you know, because they're not interested in electoral systems. And whenever I've lectured, not just to seniors groups, but in my own class, students say, no, I don't understand exactly how it will work. Well, I don't exactly understand how the income tax system works either, but I fill it out. I like the system that they had in Manitoba, and maybe because I'm familiar with it, but there you had Winnipeg was one multi-member constituency of 10 people, and the interests of people, let's say in Spadina, Fort York, are not that different from the interests of people next door in Davenport or in where I live, University Rosedale. And similarly, the people who live in Papineau, their interests aren't that different than what they are next door in Rosemont, what's the La Patrie Petite. But those collective interests are very different than the interests of people who live in Abitibi-Témiscamingue or in Kenora. So I suggest that the rank ballot could make sense outside of large cities, and in large cities have one large constituency, or in a place like Toronto or Montreal, Vancouver, maybe 3 or 4. And that system seemed to work well in Manitoba, and the one account evaluation I saw by Tom Peterson said he thought it worked out proportionately and it didn't favor any particular party. But I have to say at that time there were a lot of acclamations in rural areas. There was a coalition government in power. And the other thing is, and which we can't replicate now, is since 1974 you've put the names of parties on the ballot, and that's the real elephant in the room, because now when people go to vote, they may not know who you are, but if your name is next to Liberal and they know Justin Trudeau is a Liberal, that's what they want. So for a lot of people, the first time they find out who they're voting for is when they actually go to the ballot box. In the past, what I liked is there was an onus on the elector to get educated, because two people could run, and one says, I'm the Conservative candidate, and another one says, no, I was at a meeting and I'm the Conservative candidate. Well, okay. The people get to decide who the Conservative candidate is if they want to vote Conservative. Right now, the party leader has the ultimate voice.
Merci. On passe maintenant à M. Kenny.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up with Mr. Wiseman's recent suggestion that effort to draw an equivalence between ordinary routine amendments to elections statutes and a radical change to the system. Doesn't he find that a false equivalence? Is it not a bit disingenuous to suggest that the kind of ordinary amendments which every parliament considers and adopts without anybody suggesting there ought to be a referendum are the equivalent to a radical change in the way that we choose our elected representatives to Parliament?
Well, I guess it depends how radical. Yeah, I mean, it is a change. It's a dramatic change. And I think I believe in responsible government. That's what you were elected to do. I didn't hear anybody run in the election, either a party or a candidate, say, vote for me and I'm going to give you a referendum on electoral reform. Hey, I voted for you, so I don't have to go out to the polls again.
Well, actually, then you didn't read the policy declaration of the Conservative Party, which calls for a referendum on these issues.
I didn't hear it mentioned once on the hustings.
Well, about as often as the Liberal Party mentioned its commitment to change the system.
I agree.
Thank you. For Mr. Tanguay, he's referred to the common distinction between consensual versus majoritarian democracies. Is it not true that, broadly speaking, the consensual democracies, as generally identified by academics, tend to be smaller and more homogenous states than majoritarian democracies, which tend to be larger and more diverse?
Not all of them, no.
No. My question was about a tendency. I didn't ask about all of them.
I don't.
Benelux, Scandinavian countries, etc., tend to be consensual. Larger populations and federations tend to be
Germany.
Right. There's your exception. I'm asking about a rule, not
France.
the exception.
No, not France. It might be a tendency. Yes, certainly the Nordic model is reliant on a fairly homogeneous population. That is true.
Now, you painted a bit of a picture of the consensual democracies being sort of bucolic states where everybody's happy.
Again, we're talking about tendencies,
right.
which Leipart makes very clear.
You've indicated that's the tendency, that's the general rule. Is it not equally true that there are some of the most dysfunctional democracies in the world are in the consensual category? Right now, Spain would be a relatively good example of that. And I don't know if you've ever visited the Knesset, but political discourse in that Israeli system driven by proportional representation is not exactly very civil.
This is old hat, Mr. Kenny. The examples of Israel, or why not, you should have mentioned the Weimar Republic electing Hitler. These are the examples trotted out continually by those who are fearful of electoral reform. And it's simply it's not fair. It's not accurate. And to quote or to cite Israel indicates that you're not serious about actually being open to a discussion about the merits of electoral reform. You're simply starting off opposed to the idea. That's abundantly clear.
Sure. So I'm not serious because I'm raising concerns about consensual democracies which don't function at the same level that you suggest they generally do. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So is it not true that in the United Kingdom there was a referendum, was it 4 years ago, on changing the electoral system?
Yes, there was.
And what was the result of that?
It rejected it.
And what was the result of the referendum in British Columbia, Ontario, and PEI?
Well, one succeeded in British Columbia, as you well know, although the 58%...
And the second one?
As I mentioned in my own remarks, the Ontario failed quite spectacularly, as did the second one in British Columbia.
And in PEI in Ontario.
And in Prince Edward Island.
Your position that the people were wrong, you just want to keep trying
until they get it right?
I'm
not saying that they were wrong, but the referendum campaign, as I was involved in it, did not allow for an educated debate about the system, about the alternatives. And again, partisan posturing tended to sort of pervert the debate.
I see. So the voters are easily misled, is that what you're saying?
Sometimes, not always.
And so you want to keep trying until they get it right, or just obviate the need for a referendum altogether?
Mr. Kenny, I believe that this is an important reform for democracy, and that's why I will continue to militate in favor of electoral reform.
It's such an important reform for democracy that we cannot submit it to a democratic decision in a referendum.
As I said, you can after it's in place for one or two electoral cycles.
Okay, so we have to move on now to Mr. Aldag, actually.
Thank you. One of the items in our committee's terms of reference relates to effectiveness and legitimacy. When I was out door knocking prior to the campaign, I actually heard from a number of my constituents that they wanted to see change. It wasn't necessarily in the terms we're talking about now, electoral reform, but there were concerns about the existing system, about the kind of cynicism where their perspectives and being reflected was their vote actually counting. And so, that was one message I heard over and over again. I also heard, though, that people did have trust in our existing system. And what I'm struggling with, and I'd like your thoughts on, is as we consider moving forward to change, to achieve effectiveness and legitimacy is one of the principles we're trying to achieve. And you're also looking at your comment that there is no perfect system. How do we design something, moving forward? And I guess the question really relates to an issue of trust. So how do we move into this dialogue on electoral reform, knowing that many Canadians are actually looking for change, while they also have a sense of trust within the existing system? So how do we move that barometer? How do we go to something different and maintain trust? What words of wisdom would you have for us as we try to shift on this very important part of our democracy?
Well, I don't pretend to know how to advise you on how you can persuade the public that they ought to trust. I think trust comes when they see that there has been a legitimate process and that there's been a fair and open conversation about it, that there wasn't a kind of manipulation. I think that there's likely only to be a kind of legitimacy awarded to the system after it's been tried a couple of times and people have decided that it works. And it works fairly and in terms of their expectations and values. They will come to see that it'll work differently. It probably won't work very well the first time. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that the first election in New Zealand, most of the parties and many of the candidates operated in ways that were essentially irrational in terms of their own immediate interests, because they hadn't worked out quite how it was going to work. So it's an iterative process between politicians and voters. And they're going to have to kind of learn how to work together in a whole different set of institutional incentives and constraints. And so there'll be a lot of uncertainty. There'll be questions about legitimacy and effectiveness, but that's inevitable in any fundamental institutional reform. And so I think the best you can hope for is a kind of process that's open, that's as transparent as possible. I would think things like a free vote in Parliament would go a long way to kind of sending a signal. Questions about referendums are going to be difficult because there's a widespread view that it is important. But then there'll be hard questions about, well, what would count? Would a 50% majority in a referendum count? What if everybody east of the Ottawa River voted against a different electoral system and everybody west of the Ottawa voted for it? Then you would have a kind of legitimacy problem. And that's why, of course, we had this extraordinary double standard in British Columbia. I don't know if it was the right one, but there was a kind of perception that a kind of 50% wouldn't work if all Vancouver wanted one thing and all the rural areas wanted another thing. So there are real challenges. And again, openness, transparency, working through a process that's understood to allow all those viewpoints to be somehow weighed and balanced in what will inevitably be a series of trade-offs. Nobody's going to get all of what they want in this process. And there ought to be a process in which everybody can get what they want. So what you want is a process in which the trade-offs are seen as fair and reasonable and accord with what people understand to be decent.
Yes, you have about 45 seconds.
Okay. Do either of the others have any thoughts?
I think our system right now is very effective. One man holds a lot of power, as was pointed out by one of the members on the committee. And I think our system is very legitimate. And I think if we change the voting system, it'll probably remain effective and it'll remain legitimate. There will be a transition. I think the words of Professor Carty are very wise, really wise on this issue. The issue of trust might be much more related to things like, if all of a sudden the economy is booming, I have trust in the government, and if it's not, I lose a lot of trust. Right now, there's a lot of trust in the government.
We'll go to Mr. Blakey now, please.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm going to take, as a non-regular member of the committee, I'm going to take a little bit of liberty and just ask, in your opinion, would it be better for this committee to kind of come out with kind of general set of principles or guidelines about what a good system would look like, or do you think it would be more productive to have this committee come out with a more concrete proposal in terms of what an electoral system would look like, and then ask the government to either accept or reject that proposal? What, in your view, would be better from a process point of view? I think we started with Professor Wiseman last time. Maybe we'll start with Professor Cardy and work back the other way.
I mean, I think if the committee could have came to a conclusion that a particular kind of system would be desirable, then it would be very helpful if Parliament had a real debate, a kind of second reading and principle debate about whether this is really what they wanted to go. If you decide to go to an MMP system, they're complicated to design. I remember when the British Columbia Citizens Assembly designed their MMP system, there was, I think, 17 separate decisions that had to be made about the fundamental pieces, and then there was various subsidiary pieces, and every time you made one of those decisions, it impacted on the other 17 parts of that MMP system. And so I think, but a kind of preliminary debate about whether first past the post or the alternate vote or a compensatory system like the Law Reform Commission or an STV system would get you a long way down the road, and then there could be a kind of debate about the niceties, which is where the river, the traffic's really going to hit the chickens in terms of MPs' interests and financial interests and funding and registration of local associations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because they're all going to be deeply affected by the details. But you've got to get to that kind of principle, what type of system, before you can get to that.
Yeah, essentially, I agree totally with what Professor Cardy said. It would be better to indicate sort of the broad models that are possible here, and that ties into the question that Ms. Sahota asked earlier. What's not acceptable in Canada? Well, list PR is not acceptable. So the Israeli system is not acceptable, or the Netherlands, or anything that simply offers voters a single choice for a party. That's not acceptable. So the options are fairly clear. Alternative vote in single-member ridings, some combination of alternative vote with STV in larger ridings, mixed-member proportional, or no change. And I think if you have the broad alternatives available to voters and discuss and debate them fairly, transparently, that will serve this committee and government well.
I have great confidence in you as committee members. I think after you've been given a mandate to go out there and listen, you'll listen, and I think you have to meet. You can meet behind closed doors, work out to see if you've got a consensus or not. If you have, I think you should report that to the government, make your recommendations. Might be for a free vote, it might be for a referendum, it might be for a specific system, and let's get some action. We've had a lot of talk about changing the electoral system in the last 20 years. I don't see any action. This is more talk.
You all, of course, know that this is a different composition in terms of committee. Do you believe that this committee should persist until such time as it can examine the legislation that the government puts forward, or otherwise it would be referred to some other committee of the House, and we know that those committees are composed of a majority of government members. In your opinion, would it be good from the point of view of the legitimacy of the process to have a committee like this, with this composition, look at the legislation once we have a concrete proposal, or to have an ordinary committee of Parliament?
I think one of the great advantages of this committee is precisely how it's currently composed and how the voting rules are going to take place. And I would think that it would be best, optimal for the process if it were to continue.
Well, if the committee is successful in moving the debate ahead, then it ought to continue. If it kind of comes to a roadblock and finds it's not able to recommend, or then some other process may be necessary.
Mr. Blakey, you have about 15 seconds. I don't know if there's anything you want to say in that time. Or...
No, that's fine, thanks.
Okay. Monsieur Deltel, c'est à votre tour.
Yes. Mr. Deltel, thank you very much, Chair. Gentlemen, and Mr. Tanguay, you spoke about coalition governments, saying that might be better for Canadian democracy because it would allow parties to make compromises, that sort of thing. Over the last 100 years, we've had 28 elections in Canada. Only once did the party that received the most votes have opposition status, and that didn't last for very long. However, there are only 3 governments that have earned more than 50% of the vote. So that means that our system has always worked with majority governments, or essentially majority governments, that had not received an absolute majority of votes, but they had 100% of the power without 100% of the votes. In fact, less than 50% of the votes. But do you believe that despite that, our democracy has gone fairly well over the last 100 years? Well, yes, it's obvious that our democracy has worked well. However, once again, in my opinion, given my experience with the Law Commission and with the referendum in Ontario, I think that our system could work more efficiently and effectively, particularly when it comes to inclusiveness. The inclusion of different groups and opinions from amongst the electorate. Yes, Canada is a success. There can be no doubt of that point. But there are some problems. There are some gaps in our system, things that we could improve, and we could improve it with reform. With, for example, a proportional system, a more proportional election system. That's all. We can't say that Canada doesn't work. But to make such a radical change as this, you think that it's worth it? Because you yourself meant... I'm not sure about the word radical. I've heard that many times here today. There are all kinds of countries that have reformed their electoral systems. This isn't as radical a reform as all that. This is rather, in fact, the mechanics of transferring votes into seats. That's it. Well, you've mentioned that our current system has worked pretty well. We have good political stability and we have a good economy. So generally speaking, things are going well. I'm not saying that. It's Mr. Wiseman who has said that. And that was on March 13th, 2008 at the Parliamentary Commission, or the Senate Committee, which said,
we have political stability. We have a thriving economy. Unquote. Vous êtes d'accord avec ça?
Ça fonctionne.
It works for who? Again, well, it works for Canadians, sir. Not for all Canadians. Not for all Canadians. There's the fact that there is an interest in electoral reform indicates that it's not working for everyone. And that's the basis of my recommendations, is that a more proportional system would work for more people, specifically young people, for those who have opinions that are outside the center of the political spectrum. For example, the Green Party. There should be more representatives of the Green Party in the House of Commons. Well, we know who you're going to be voting for next time. Now, I imagine that if you make such a change as this, it's much more than just changing a few words on the ballot. The changes that the government are calling for are radical changes. No, this is not a radical change. It's so not radical that again, our chief electoral officer has said too many people are speaking at once. We should now allow Mr. Tanguay to finish answering before going to the next question. Mr. Tanguay, we changed the election system here in Canada at the provincial level many times in the past. Many times these election systems have been changed without referendum. Changes on the way that we've chosen MPs? Yes. For example, the system described by Nelson Wiseman. And when the people were consulted, the people have said that they don't want changes. What I don't understand is how you, who are a partisan of democracy, you don't want us to consult the people on such an important change to the democratic system. And I've said this many times. Well, I've said this many times. I've already answered that question. Yes, many times. Yes, so now we'll move to Ms. Romanado, who has the final question for this afternoon. So the honor is all yours. Well, thank you very much.
didn't have a chance to answer my previous question regarding mandatory voting. I just wanted to give you that opportunity to answer that question. If we were to go that route, what would the Canadian model look like, and would it be a carrot or stick suggestion?
Again, this isn't something that I've done a lot of research on personally, and I would simply sort of reiterate what Professor Carty said. So the Australian system, with a bit of a stick, I cannot take seriously the proposal to give people tax credits for showing up to vote. I think there should be a modest penalty if they don't show up to vote. So again, yeah, the Australian system, I think, is the one that recommends itself.
And so my question is now to the three panelists. In your opinion, what electoral system should be implemented that would reflect the composition of Canadian society today? So you had mentioned that, I believe it was Professor Tanguay, you mentioned that we should be promoting demographic representation and so on and so forth. So what model, in all three of your opinion, would best make sure that we are reflecting the demographic of Canada today?
Some version of the model that was described in the Law Commission of Canada's report. So some form of mixed member proportional would, I think, do the best job. Again, it's not going to be perfect. There's still going to be flaws in the electoral system, but I think it would do a better job than the current one of representing more sections of society, of producing a parliament that had a greater variety of representatives drawn from a broader range of categories of society. So on the whole, I think that MMP is the system that recommends itself. It's not perfect, but it would be better.
The more I hear about MMP, the less I'm enamored with it. And one of the reasons is because what I've been hearing is that for people, their local MP is very important. But again, this is why I think the system I'm talking about makes the most sense. Because if you live in a large metropolitan area, it doesn't matter if the MP represents Davenport or Spadina-Fort York. The issues are similar. However, if you live outside of those cities, it's very vital. So if you live in Dauphin or Salmon Arm, I want to know who the MP is. And the trouble, of course, with MMPs, you have two classes of MPs. One is tied down, you know, handling passport issues, immigration, vets issues, and the other is a prima donna who can just focus on foreign policy or defense policy. And one other thing, if you're going to have a referendum, why does Canada, why does it cost $300 million? And why does it cost a year and a half or 2 years? Why does it take that long? Greece called a referendum on June the 27th, 2015, and they had a vote on July the 5th. You've just made such elaborate and expensive rules around elections and referenda. And no one thinks that the Greek vote was undemocratic.
Professor Carty?
Well, I don't know that I believe there is a system that will be better. I think every system will be different and will produce a different looking house. And some of it comes down to, you know, how we think about elections. You know, what are they and what are they for? Well, partly they're to produce a representative assembly, but also they're about connecting citizens to governments. Are they a series of individual contests, or are they somehow more diffuse contests? And how do we think about it? And I used to say sometimes to my students, you know, who should win the Stanley Cup? The team that wins the most games or the team that scores the most goals over 7 games? And they say, well, the team that wins the most games. And I would say, well, what if we just changed it and played 7 games and the team that scored the most goals should win? They say, well, that wouldn't be right. And I would say, well, why? And it's because it's how we think about it. We think about elections. We think about Stanley Cups as winning games. And we now think about elections as kind of winning local contests. And you win the most, then you win. If we change the system, we're going to change how we think about elections and what they are. And we're going to go away from this most games metaphor to something else. It won't be to the total goal system, because that would be pure PR on the national level, a la Netherlands or Israel, but it'll be something in between. And so it's about how we think about what we're engaged in here. And it's imagining a new way to think about it that I think you're charged with being involved with.
As Canadians, it's only right and just that we end on hockey. Mais j'aimerais
I would like to thank our witnesses. It's important to note that they are here in this final week of July. So I think that must be mentioned. Thank you for this lively and agreeable and frank and open discussion. I think I speak for all members of the committee when I say that we have truly benefited from this discussion.
It really fleshed out the issues that we have to consider. And again, thank you for being here in the last week of July. I would just like to remind members that our meeting tomorrow starts at 9:30 at 1 Wellington. So not here in 1 Wellington. And for members of the subcommittee, the steering committee will be breaking for 15 minutes and will resume in camera. So thank you again, and to members and witnesses, and we'll see most of you tomorrow.
Meeting adjourned.
Meeting adjourned.